Welcome back. This story just into CNN. Taliban insurgents attacked a small military base in Afghanistan. That attack killing 18 Afghan soldiers. A large number of insurgents were also killed during the fight. But Afghan officials aren't saying how many. The attack happened in the western province of Farah on Saturday. Turning now to Syria, where things often look like they couldn't be worse, and then they turn out to be worse. As seen here by civilians in eastern Ghouta. They've been hammered for weeks now by daily and deadly bombardments, and now they say they're being hit with a new kind of rocket, a rocket that spreads fire. All of this playing out as people there hope for a 30-day ceasefire, but the UN failed to vote on the resolution Friday. Backers say they hope to try again for a vote in the coming hours. Let's bring in CNN senior international correspondent Ben Wiedemann, following the story from neighboring Lebanon, live in Beirut this hour. It's good to have you with us, Ben. This obviously goes without question to say there's a lot at stake with this possible vote in the coming hours. Set the stage for us as to why the first vote didn't come together.
Well, actually, George, they've been meeting since Thursday, trying to agree on some sort of resolution that would, within 72 hours, bring into effect a 30-day humanitarian ceasefire. The sticking point, we understand, is that the Russians want American guarantees that the rebel groups operating in eastern Ghouta, the main ones are Jaish al-Islam and Faylaq ar-Rahman, will abide by the ceasefire. And of course, the problem here is that the Americans essentially shut down their operation room in Jordan that was providing money and weapons to the rebels in Syria, and therefore they don't really have much control over those groups anymore. Saudi Arabia and Qatar were also providing support for them, but their support has also dwindled as they've wearied with the conflict in Syria. So it's not clear if anybody can satisfy the Russian demands. Earlier, the Russians had also said that they would respect a truce, but accepted from the truce would be any fighters with ISIS or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the Nusra Front renamed, rebranded, so to speak. So there's no guarantee at this point. After today, it will be 3 days of discussions in the UN Security Council that they're going to come to any agreement. And what we're hearing from within eastern Ghouta, from civilians, from doctors, is that the situation is getting even worse. People are afraid to even go outside to bury the dead. Food, water, medical supplies are dangerously low, and therefore they don't have a lot of time to waste waiting for the diplomats in New York to come to some sort of agreement on this humanitarian ceasefire. George?
All right, Ben, those are the facts first. Ben, thank you for the reporting. Let's get some context now, bringing in Fawaz Gerges. Fawaz is the professor at the London School of Economics and has written extensively about conflicts in the Middle East. Live with us this hour from London. It's good to have you with us, sir. Let's talk more about this delayed vote, mainly coming down to Russia, which stands as a shield as well to the Syrian government. Let's talk about those sticking points that our Ben Wiedemann just laid out that stand in the way of a ceasefire. What's holding this up?
George, Russia is not coming out and saying what it really wants. What Russia wants is for the rebels, who number about 5,000 strong in eastern Ghouta, to be evacuated sooner rather than later. This is the strategic goal of Russia. This is the strategic goal of Iran, and this is the strategic goal of Syria. The reality is the Russians are very upset, very angry, because the rebels have, of course, they did not attend the Sochi conference. There have been talks between the rebels and the Russians and the Egyptians about evacuation from eastern Ghouta. And the conditions, basically, the rebels would not accept the conditions. What you are seeing now in eastern Ghouta is negotiation by blood and fire. What the Russians and the Syrians and their allies are trying to do is to basically to terrorize the civilians and the rebels and force a settlement whereby, at the end of the day, the soft belly of Damascus, for your own viewers, eastern Ghouta is 5 miles away from the heart of Damascus. It's the soft belly of Damascus. It's the last strong area held by the rebels. And what Assad and the Russians and everyone is trying to do is to really win the war militarily, because the evacuation of Eastern Ghouta by the rebels would mean basically the last major stronghold held by the rebels. And that's why the Russians are really pushing very hard. They don't just want a ceasefire. They want a conditional ceasefire based on the fact that the rebels at the end of the day, if not today, in a month or so, would be evacuated from Eastern Ghouta.
All right, look, this vote, the significance for the Security Council, very important. It's not only for the implications on the ground for people in Syria, but also regarding the credibility of this body itself.
Well, George, we have been there before. How many times have we talked about the credibility of the Security Council, about that the international community has let the Syrian people down for the last 7 years? Think of how many times you and I have spoken about Aleppo. What you are seeing in Eastern Ghouta is a repeat of the Aleppo battle. In fact, these are not my words. Those are the words of the Russian Foreign Minister, Lavrov, just a few days ago. He said, quote unquote, and I'm paraphrasing, we think we could repeat the Aleppo model in Eastern Ghouta. The United States is marginalized, is nowhere to be seen. Donald Trump is not interested except in ISIS, and the international community has no teeth. The Russians have the upper hand in Syria, and what the Russians are trying to do is to send a message not only to the rebels, but even to the United States and the European powers. That is the king, Putin, President Putin, is the kingmaker. And what you're really seeing is that this is the brutality of international relations. Basically, blood and fire determines basically it's the balance of power. And what the Russians are saying, look, we have the means to terrorize the civilians and the rebels, and by the end of the day, you have to accept our way, or basically hell.
Let's talk about that. We're talking geopolitics here, but at the same time, right now, there are families living underground. There are families hiding from bombs, from double taps, unsure of whether they will find food or water, people that are just simply trying to survive right now. Help our viewers understand the living hell that is their daily lives and why this possible vote is so critical.
You're absolutely correct. I mean, the humanitarian situation is basically hellish. You have a bloodbath. You have 400,000 civilians who live in a very small area called Eastern Ghouta. Remember, George, they have been under siege for more than 5 years. So the situation is hellish. Now it's a bloodbath. It's hellish bloodbath because you have hundreds of civilians, including children, who have been injured and killed. The reality is, the question at the end of the day, Russia's interests basically top everything else. And sadly and tragically, the United States and the international community have not been able to engage the Russians seriously about a way out. So what you really have in Syria now, and we talked about it 2 weeks ago, is a fierce geostrategic struggle between regional powers and global powers. You have Turkey, you have Israel, you have Iran, they're fighting it in Syria, and you have the United States, and you have Russia. And the Russians are trying to say, well, look, we have the dominant position, and we're going to establish the rules of the game. So far, the Russians have a military dominant position, but they have not been able to translate their military position into political capital. They're angry because the conference in Russia, in Sochi, really failed. And the Russians are saying to the rebels, we're going to show you our own way. That's really what you're seeing going on in Eastern Ghouta, but also in terms of the civil war inside Syria, Eastern Ghouta is really existential for Assad. It's just 5 miles away from the heart of Damascus. The rebels have been shelling Damascus almost on a daily basis. Of course, the rebels don't really have the same weapons, the brutal weapons that the Assad regime has. But this is really a very, very existential question for Assad in terms of winning the war militarily and securing Damascus.
Fawaz George is live for us in London. Thank you. The United States and to our viewers around the world this hour. You're watching CNN Newsroom. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm George Howell with the headlines we're following for you. Former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort. He's facing new charges that he secretly paid former European politicians to lobby in the United States on behalf of Ukraine. Now Manafort's former aide, Rick Gates, could testify against him in the Russia investigation. Gates pleaded guilty Friday and admitted that he and Manafort lied and hid millions of dollars that they made during their pro-Ukrainian lobbying work. The U.S. is imposing more sanctions on North Korea, this time sanctions targeting dozens of shipping companies and vessels suspected of helping North Korea evade trade restrictions. Officials say it's part of a campaign of maximum pressure to rid the Korean peninsula of nuclear weapons. In the U.S. state of Florida, we're learning more details about the missteps in the response to a high school massacre there. Word that not one, but possibly 4 law enforcement officers waited outside as a gunman mowed down high school students and teachers. And in a call to the FBI in January, an unidentified woman said that the shooter, Nicholas Cruz, was, quote, going to explode. Of course, there is a great deal of anger and a lot of frustration over these missed signs and these failures to act. One of those frustrated is Samantha Fuentes, a senior at the school. She was shot in both legs and hospitalized. She spoke earlier to my colleague Aaron Burnett on Aaron Burnett Out Front. Listen.
Everyone has reported this kid, and we thought that we did everything in our power to get him off of school grounds, get him away from us, because he was a violent and malicious person, and that was obvious. And kids would even joke about how he was going to be the next school shooter. And as students, we can only do so much. We thought that if we put it into the hands of the law and the hands of our government, that it would be handled.
President Trump called Samantha while she was in the hospital. She said the experience was a little bizarre.
One of the first things he said to me was that he heard that I was a big fan of his and that he was a big fan of mine, and he was just trying to console me and let me know that everything was going to be okay. He then commenced to call the shooter a sick puppy and probably used the word, oh boy, probably a solid 8 times.
Against Samantha there, a shot in both legs and hospitalized. She spoke earlier to Aaron Burnett. A Florida Republican congressman and Army combat veteran now says that he supports the ban of future purchases of the AR-15 weapons. His powerful op-ed in the New York Times is headlined, "I'm a Republican and I appreciate weapons and I support a ban." Brian Mast says changing laws will save lives.
The platform that I carried, an M4 carbine, very similar to an AR-15. I was carrying that weapon on the battlefield in the most dangerous country on earth for one reason, because of its lethality. It was the best weapon that the Army could give me to go out there and make sure that I could eliminate our enemies. I can honestly say that my community and my kids in our schools, I don't think that they're made safer by the general population of civilians having unfettered access to the best weapon the Army could put in my hand to go out there and kill our enemies.
All right, aside from those officers that apparently didn't respond, first responders are often seen as stoic heroes, people who can work through tragic circumstances. But for some who responded to the Parkland massacre, recounting those moments triggers very strong emotions. CNN's Rosa Flores sat down with 3 of them.
You're anticipating you're going to take gunfire, like you're looking for it.
These first responders were among the first to enter Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School after a gunman fired indiscriminately at students and teachers.
First thing we saw, there was a victim right outside the west doors. We checked on that victim. That victim was deceased.
At that moment, I actually felt sick, but I know I have a job to do.
The building, they say, riddled with bullet holes. Inside, a chilling silence.
We'd think there'd be smoke alarms and screaming. It was eerily silent.
Very poor visibility, just from the amount of gunfire that had taken place. Spent shell casings all over ground. You can see multiple victims in the hallway immediately that were beyond assistance.
Inside classrooms, students and teachers taking cover and calling this 911 center. Dispatchers say victims were afraid to speak, so they listened for breathing as a sign of life.
You just have to be quiet. That's okay, as long as I can hear you breathing.
White male, burgundy shirt. They are monitoring the subject right now.
Sergeant Mazzy was on the second floor when this came over the radio.
He went from the third floor to the second floor.
We were very prepared for it. We anticipated engaging him.
Turns out the video was not live. It was on a delay, so they advanced to the third floor.
I look down, I'm standing on top of the rifle. His rifle's there, his vest is there.
And then a faint call for help.
I would open up the door again. I'm sorry. And the kid deserves a lot of credit.
I had a firefighter texting me the whole time. I'm looking for my friend's daughter that's on the third floor. I don't know.
As for these heroes who respond to the unthinkable, they felt blessed to hug their own children.
And he goes, "Daddy, I love you." That was tough for me.
And even though they hope it never happens again.
But if it does, I want to make sure that, you know, I'm there.
Rosa Flores, CNN, Parkland, Florida.
All credit to the men and women who went in there and did what they did. Still ahead, she is called the U.S. Charmer-in-Chief, and she's in South Korea. How Donald Trump's daughter, Ivanka, is practicing diplomacy at the Winter Olympic Games. Plus, another Russian athlete has been found guilty of doping. How this could affect the Olympic athletes from Russia and their closing ceremony procession. CNN has a live report from Pyeongchang ahead. Aiming for the gold, the U.S. President's daughter, Ivanka Trump, is cheering on Team USA at the 2018 Winter Games. She is in Pyeongchang, South Korea, ahead of Sunday night's closing ceremonies. CNN's Paula Hancock is following the story live from Pyeongchang this hour. Paula, let's talk about the political tensions clearly that exist beyond the Olympic Games. The question, has Ivanka Trump's presence there been mainly symbolic, or is there more to it? Is she active on other fronts?
Well, George, certainly the fact is that U.S. President Donald Trump's daughter is here cheering on the Team USA athletes, but certainly she's here for something more important than that. She is part of this delegation. She's leading the delegation. She came with a message for President Moon Jae-in of South Korea at the banquet meeting on Friday night. She was detailing the sanctions that the U.S. Treasury Department have just added. They say that they are the most significant sanctions and the heaviest sanctions against North Korea, against shipping companies, against vessels. There's 27 entities, 28 vessels which have been sanctioned to make sure that North Korea is not able to import or export things that it is not supposed to be against United Nations sanctions. Also saying that they would punish people who are trying to help them avoid those sanctions. So this is part of the message that Ivanka Trump has been bringing to the South Koreans. We heard also that President Moon told her at this banquet meeting that even though the North and South Koreans were going to be talking, it was very important that that was in conjunction with talking about denuclearization, that the two were not mutually exclusive. George?
Paula Hancock's live for us in Pyeongchang. Thank you very much. Now let's get more on the exciting competition that's happening in Pyeongchang. Let's cross over to CNN World Sports. Amanda Davis. Amanda, good to have you with us.
Hi, George. Yeah, day 15, and we've had a Winter Olympic first. Saturday, the 24th of February 2018 is a day that Esther Ledecker will not forget. It's the day she made history, claiming her second gold medal in her second sport at this Games, having shocked the world and herself to win gold in the Alpine skiing Super G last week. Today, she's followed it up with victory in the snowboard parallel giant slalom. The 22-year-old was the favourite for today. She romped through for the victory, so you suspect she won't have made the same mistake she did last week in not putting on any makeup, which meant she felt she had to do her press conference in her ski goggles. That was the Czech Republic's 7th medal of the Games, though, and there's been a record for Norway as well. Their bronze in the alpine skiing mixed team event was their 38th medal, which sees them surpass the total of most medals ever by a country at a single Winter Olympics, which is quite incredible given the size of their team. They have just 109 athletes, in contrast to the USA's 242, for example. It certainly left a lot of the other teams scratching their heads, trying to work out how they've done it. And talking of head scratching, you'd think a fair amount of that will be going on at the IOC Executive Board meeting here in Pyeongchang. It's the meeting where they're discussing whether or not to allow the banned Russian team to transform from their neutral uniforms, that Olympic flag, back to using their own Russian flag and Russian kit for Sunday evening's closing ceremony. You may remember it was put on the table as an option when the deal was struck to allow some Russian athletes to compete despite their national ban for state-sponsored doping. And it's a decision that Russian whistleblower Grigory Rodchenkov has described as the most important moment in its history for the IOC, but one that has most definitely been complicated by the failed drugs test of bobsledder Nadezhda Sagieva. She became the second member of the team of the Olympic athletes from Russia to fail a test during this Games. That happened just yesterday, Friday. So 2 of 4 positive tests at this Games have come from the team that is meant to represent the new clean face of Russian sport. So it'll be very interesting to see how the board feels that plays into that ideal that we've heard a lot in the last week of the OAR team competing by the letter of the law and the spirit of the Games. We're actually expecting to find out the ruling on Sunday lunchtime, just a few hours ahead of that closing ceremony, George.
All right, Amanda, we'll be looking ahead to it. Thank you, and we'll stay in touch. I want to tell you about March 14th as well, the 2nd annual My Freedom Day. CNN is partnering with people around the world for a student-led day of action against modern-day slavery. We've been asking people what freedom means to them. Here's what freedom means to American Olympic figure skater Nathan Shen.
Freedom means being able to be who you are whenever, wherever, say whatever you would like, and just truly be yourself.
What does freedom mean to you? Well, you can share your story. Just use the hashtag MyFreedomDay, and we'll be sure to see that and pick it up there. Still ahead here on Newsroom, moviegoers around the world, they are filling theaters to see the movie Black Panther. Why so many, though, say this is about more than just a superhero. Missed opportunities by multiple officers and an ignored tip call, all raising concerns about the handling of the Parkland, Florida shooting. Plus, giving in to pressure. Could the latest guilty plea in Robert Mueller's Russia investigation be a major turning point? We'll look into that. And if Ivanka Trump cheering on Team USA in South Korea as they take home another gold medal. We are live at CNN World Headquarters in Atlanta, and we want to welcome our viewers here in the United States and all around the world. I'm George Howell. CNN Newsroom starts right now. "5 a.m. here on the U.S. East Coast, and we start with failures and missed signals. Sadly, the Florida school massacre is becoming a deadly combination of both. We've learned that not one, but possibly 4 law enforcement officers, they waited outside as the gunman inside mowed down high school students and teachers in cold blood. And there are more details on the missed signals that, if acted upon, could have kept a weapon, the weapon of the mass murderer, out of the hands of disturbed teenagers. We begin with Martin Savage's report.
The call to an FBI tip line about Nicholas Cruz could not have been more clear, warning that Cruz is, quote, going to explode. CNN's reviewed the transcript of the January 5th, 2018 call, informing the agency about the Parkland, Florida shooter. The unidentified woman spoke of Cruz's Instagram feed. She talked of his posts about guns and was, quote, afraid something's going to happen. The caller also talked about Cruz's history of violence in school and said she worried about him, quote, getting into a school and just shooting the place up. 40 days later, Cruz did just that. The FBI admits it failed to follow up on the tip. The missed call is just one of a growing list of failures by authorities that could have prevented tragedy if only they'd been handled differently. They include the case of school resource officer Scott Peterson, seen here in 2015, speaking about his job.
We're all here for the same goal, to protect our kids.
Peterson resigned and retired rather than face suspension without pay and a pending internal investigation into what he did or did not do at the time of the high school shooting. Broward County Sheriff Scott Israel says for at least 4 minutes as the attack was going on, school surveillance video shows Peterson just standing beside the building rather than entering to engage the gunman. Some angry parents have suggested Peterson was more worried about retirement than protecting students, something the officers seemed to joke about in 2015.
I'm almost on my way out. I'm 30 years.
But Peterson's not the only sheriff's deputy accused of not reacting properly. Sources telling CNN say some Coral Springs officers were shocked to see deputies standing outside the school shooting site even as they rushed in. But at a news conference today, the Coral Springs Police Department refused to talk about those accusations. Instead, first responders talked about what they did.
Immediately, I grabbed my rifle and I start running.
Officer Tim Burton is believed to be the first Coral Springs officer to arrive on scene, charging alone toward the building.
I thought I was going to encounter the shooter as soon as I made that left-hand turn in the parking lot, if he was trying to escape or get away.
Instead, Burton found only silence. The first Coral Springs officer to arrive heard no gunfire. But Officer Jeff Heinrich did hear gunfire. In fact, he heard it all, recounting the moment the shooting began.
I hear what I now know to be 5 or 6 gunshots. At first, I honestly thought they were fireworks.
Heinrich was off duty and without his weapon, volunteering at the high school, watering the baseball field. Moments later, more gunfire. He knew it was real. He also knew his wife, a teacher, and his son, a student, were both inside.
Kids started to run. Kids started to scream. That time I heard a round of probably about another 5 or 6 shots.
Wearing just shorts and a T-shirt, Heinrich ran in the direction of gunfire, first tending to a gravely wounded student, then, as other officers arrived, grabbing a spare vest and gun.
He got his gun, his secondary weapon, and we systematically cleared back towards the 12 building.
There is yet to be any official police timeline that will tell us exactly who responded first, from what department, and where they went when they got on scene. That report will be critical. It's expected possibly as early as next week. In the meantime, though, it is very clear that this is a community still very much deeply in grief. And the shock is affecting not just the civilians, but the first responders as well. Martin Savage, CNN, Parkland.
Martin, thank you. There is plenty of anger and a great deal of frustration over the missed signals and the failures to act. One of those frustrated is Samantha Fuentes. Samantha, a senior at the school, she was shot in both legs and, as you see there, hospitalized. She spoke earlier with CNN's Aaron Burnett.
Parents and teachers and faculty and students, everyone has reported this kid. And we thought that we did everything in our power to get him off of school grounds, get him away from us, because he was a violent and malicious person. And that was obvious. And kids would even joke about how he was going to be the next school shooter. And as students, we can only do so much. We thought that if we put it into the hands of the law and the hands of our government, that it would be handled. But unfortunately, as students, now we have to take action because our government is failing us, our system is failing us, and we won't be stopped.
Samantha says the school resource officer who didn't go into the building, that he took an oath to protect and serve, and that he broke that promise. In the meantime, the U.S. President Donald Trump is doubling down on his call to put guns in the hands of school teachers. He says an armed teacher in Florida last week could have stopped the shooter.
It's not all of them, but you would have a lot, and you would tell people that they're inside. And the beauty is it's concealed. Nobody would ever see it unless they needed it. It's concealed. So this crazy man who walked in wouldn't even know who it is that has it. That's good. It's not bad. That's good. And a teacher would have shot the hell out of him before he knew what happened.
Well, the U.S. president there speaking at CPAC. CNN's Jeff Zeleny has more now on President Trump's plan to address gun control in the United States.
President Trump is pledging to get Congress to act on gun policies, but he has stopped short of any specific ideas for legislation. One thing the president has seized on again and again in the wake of that Florida shooting is the idea of arming school teachers and other school officials. He said it is those teachers who could actually prevent school shootings in the future. He talked very aggressively about why.
See, a security guard doesn't know the children, doesn't love the children. This man standing outside of the school the other day doesn't love the children, probably doesn't know the children.
Now, this idea has been roundly rejected by education groups, teachers, and others. It was an idea that was first raised by the National Rifle Association some 5 years ago in the wake of the Sandy Hook school shooting. Back then, it was simply viewed as a fringe idea. And now it is being pushed by the President of the United States. Now, it is unclear if Congress or any states would actually act on this. The Florida governor, Rick Scott, a Republican, says he does not support this idea. One idea he does support is raising the age limit for people to buy rifles and other long guns from 18 to 21. Now, that is something President Trump also said earlier in the week he supported, but did not mention it again on Friday. Of course, the NRA strongly opposed to any changes in gun limits. So as another week ends, clearly there is a sign from the president wanting to do something on guns. No clear sign what types of legislation that may be. Jeff Zeleny, CNN, the White House.
Jeff, thanks for the reporting. Now, as Jeff mentioned, Florida Governor Rick Scott is proposing raising the age limit to 21 to buy a firearm. His $450 million action plan would also assign one school officer per 1,000 students, and it would increase funding for metal detectors, bulletproof glass, and for steel doors. The plan calls for more mental health counselors and a ban on so-called bump stocks. Scott says these funding changes may mean there won't be tax cuts this year.
The goal of this plan of action is to make massive changes in protecting our schools, provide significantly more resources for mental health, and to do everything we can to keep guns out of the hands of those dealing with mental problems or threatening harms to themselves or others.
In the meantime, faculty and students returned to Stoneman Douglas High School on Friday, the first time they returned since the massacre that killed 17 people at that school. One of those returning was history teacher Diane Wolk-Rogers. She also appeared at the CNN town hall earlier this week. That's where she confronted a spokesperson for the NRA, the National Rifle Association, about some of the group's positions. Later, she spoke with CNN's John Berman about President Trump's proposal to put guns in the hands of teachers. Let's listen.
If what you're telling me is that we have trained professionals who weren't able to follow protocol, then I can imagine my teachers overworked, underpaid, exhausted, carrying a sidearm, and then being able to perform that protocol. And I want to talk about the white elephant in the room, because what we know is that students of color get suspended and get expelled at a higher rate than white kids. So now what are we going to say, Mr. Trump? We're going to say that now students of color are going to be shot at by teachers at a higher rate? It's absolutely ludicrous.
While many argued teachers should not be armed in a classroom, there are some in the United States, some parts where, well, that idea is welcomed, as CNN's Ed Lavandera reports for us.
We'll do whatever's necessary to protect our kids and staff.
This is the stark message that greets you when you walk into one of the two school buildings in Callisburg, Texas. Superintendent Steve Clugston oversees what the school district calls the Guardian Program. It's a small force of volunteer school staff allowed to carry a concealed firearm, and Clugston says they're equipped to confront an active shooter.
We don't want to be at the mercy of, somebody that's intent on doing harm. We refuse to be that person.
In the wake of the Stoneman Douglas High School shooting, the idea of arming teachers has sparked outrage.
Am I supposed to have a Kevlar vest? Am I supposed to strap it to my leg or put it on my desk?
I don't believe teachers should be armed. I believe teachers should teach.
But in some mostly rural communities across the country, the idea of arming teachers is welcomed, even by some students. Like this freshman and junior at Callisburg High School, who asked that we not identify them.
I feel protected. I don't feel like they're going to threaten me in any way. I feel like if someone came in, that I know that they're going to handle it. So I feel very protected.
I feel really safe knowing that I can come to school
and if there's like an incident that does happen, that they'll be able to like protect us.
Out of the roughly 1,000 school districts across the state of Texas, there are about 170 that have a policy of allowing teachers or administrators to carry a firearm on campus. Here in the small town of Callisburg, their Guardian program was implemented about 4 years ago, in large part because the city doesn't have a local police department. They rely on county sheriffs. And in a county this large, it can take many minutes for those deputies to respond to something like a shooting scene inside a school. Clugston says the school's Guardian force undergoes active shooter scenario training once a year and routine target practice at gun ranges. But critics say that isn't enough. The school officer at Stoneman Douglas, who was trained far more extensively, waited outside the building as the gunman unleashed a deadly massacre. Steve Clugston is convinced that if his Guardians face the same ordeal, they won't flinch.
We're trying to put our teachers in a position to be better equipped to protect their kids. And I have complete faith in our team that they're willing to stand up and protect our people.
The armed teachers here haven't faced the worst-case scenario, so the question remains, how will they react if they're forced to face a killer? Ed Lavendera, CNN, Callisburg, Texas.
It is fair to say the gun debate drags on here in the United States. At the same time, a number of companies are now cutting ties with the National Rifle Association, that powerful lobby group that defends Americans' gun rights. Car rental companies Enterprise, Alamo, Hertz, National, Avis, and Budget. They're all stopping discount programs for NRA members. The same for MetLife Insurance and Allied and North American van lines. First National Bank of Omaha is stopping its NRA-branded Visa card as well. Still ahead here on CNN Newsroom, prosecutors slam charges against former Trump aide Paul Manafort. This as his former employee gets ready to open up to Robert Mueller and his investigation. We'll have the very latest as Newsroom pushes on. You see the video there, that happening day after day in Syria, a town there under siege as a ceasefire vote stalls.
Police released 911 call from Nicolai's Cruz after fight over guns just months before Florida shooting. Officials released Friday a 911 call a woman made in 2017 when her son kicked Florida shooter Nicolai's Cruz out of their house after he began tearing their home apart. Cruz was involved in a fight with the adult son of a woman he was staying with shortly after his mother died, according to a Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office report. He is accused of shooting and killing 17 people earlier this month at a high school in Parkland. He came in the house and started banging all the doors and banging all the walls, hitting the walls, throwing everything in the room, and then my son got in there, Roxanne and Rock Deschamps told police dispatchers in November of 2017. According to a report from local news affiliates. Rock Deschamps tossed Cruz out the house shortly thereafter. Roxanne, his mother, called the police once Cruz was removed from the house. She left the house. But I need somebody here because I'm afraid he comes back, and he has a lot of weapons, she said, referring to guns Roxanne Deschamps believed Cruz stashed around the home. Rock Deschamps told the dispatcher that Cruz wants his guns. That's all he wants is his gun, and that's all he cares about is his gun. He bought tons of ammo, bullets and stuff, and I took them away from him, he said. The incident paints the image of a very troubled man struggling to deal with the loss of his mother. Cruz told a deputy after being spotted at a nearby park that he had been angry because he misplaced a photo of his recently deceased mother and he apologized for losing his temper. The incident comes after members of the media criticized the FBI and other federal officials for dismissing or ignoring warning signs that Cruz was a ticking time bomb. The FBI was warned twice about Cruz. The first warning came after the teen commented on YouTube, "I'm going to be a professional school shooter," posting the dark prediction under his own name. The second warning came when someone close to Cruz called the FBI tip line to warn them that the 19-year-old had expressed a desire to kill people and was a potential school shooter. The caller provided information about Cruz's gun ownership, desire to kill people, erratic behavior, and disturbing social media posts, as well as the potential of him conducting a school shooting, FBI Director Chris Wray admitted last week in a statement. A version of this article appeared on the Daily Caller News Foundation website. What do you think? Scroll down to comment below.